Meanwhile, unprecedented protests are sweeping several Chinese cities in a rare show of defiance against President Xi Jinping. Many demonstrators have been detained today as the police crack down. The protests sparked off by the country's tough zero-COVID policy, which has seen millions in lockdown on and off for nearly 3 years now. Joining us first tonight, India's former Foreign Secretary and former Ambassador to China, Nirupama Menon Rao. Thank you very much, ma'am, for being with us. How do you look at the very fact that you have people, ma'am, coming out in these large numbers? You don't see that happening in China, and even calling for him to resign, calling for Xi Jinping to resign.
Yes, Nidhi, I think it's quite unprecedented and something perhaps that many people thought might happen, but we hardly expect it to happen the way it has today in such a cascading manner. I think there's been a popular mood of frustration that has built up with all the COVID-19 related restrictions in China, which has essentially stretched on for almost 3 years now. Now, it's not that demonstrations are foreign to China. In fact, I think every other day you come across news of a small demonstration here or there just to express popular discontent with a local issue. But this is much more than a local issue. It seems to be a nationwide expression of discontent, a real winter of discontent that is approaching as far as China is concerned. So the mood is one of frustration, popular frustration, and it comes at a time when COVID hasn't really gone away from China. There's a rising number of infections, and there's inadequate coverage of vaccinations where the people are concerned. The elderly are particularly vulnerable, so you know,
but the question,
ma'am, is where catch-22 situation at the moment.
But where do these protests go from here? We've just seen President Xi actually strengthen his authority only in October, and some are saying he's looking to perhaps be president of China for a life term. Now, does this impact him in any way politically, actually, in China?
Well, as someone said, Xi Jinping is definitely a lightning rod for this unrest, because certain red lines have been crossed in this current wave of demonstrations. Because people in China demonstrate, as I said, it happens quite more than occasionally, but nobody crosses that third rail, which is criticism of the Communist Party of China and of the leadership. And today in Shanghai, and perhaps also in Beijing, you come across expressions of protest which seem to be focused on the leadership of the Communist Party. And as I said, Xi Jinping is the lightning rod for this protest. It's still too early to really forecast where these protests will ultimately go, where they will terminate. Will they pick up? Will they become more widespread? We really can't say. And this comes at a time when the economy is slowing down. People are, definitely they're feeling the pain of the last 3 years, particularly on the economic front too.
Right.
And if there is a government crackdown on the protest, as there well could be, we really don't know what the end state is going to be like. There's no real guarantee of how these protests will end.
A very fluid situation, as you say, there in China at the moment. Nirupama Menon Rao, thank you very much for joining us on NDTV today. Thank you. We're also joined now from Beijing by Aina Tangen, Senior Fellow with the Tahe Institute and Chairman of Asia Narratives with a channel based in Beijing, of the Asia Narratives channel, which is based in Beijing. Thank you so much, Mr. Aina Tangen, for joining us. How do you look at these unprecedented protests, and where do you see this going?
Well, I do see it as serious. I agree with my diplomatic colleague when she says that there's a lot of frustration, obviously. And also, this is really crossing what is generally a red line, and that is attacks directly against the government. But I think she overstated this idea that China's been in lockdown for 3 years. It hasn't. It's been under a zero COVID policy. It's been very successful. China is the only major economy that's been able to grow. But at this juncture, they do face some issues. One is the frustration, mostly because people in China are watching the World Cup and they see stadiums full of people shouting, having a good time and watching, and they say, well, why can't that be us? Well, in China's case, they took their foot off the gas in terms of getting boosters and getting more people vaccinated. So now they have a large elderly population who isn't vaccinated. They never saw the need because they didn't know anybody who got it. They said, well, we just stay at home. But they're particularly vulnerable in a pandemic situation. So they need to get 60% of their people vaccinated or boosted within a 6-month period, the last 6-month period, in order to open up. They'll still need lots of Paxlovid, which is a very potent medicine
Absolutely.
that can help ward off things. Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, I just meant to ask how you look at the fact that, you have these sort of unprecedented scenes of people, protesters, also asking for the resignation of President Xi. How seriously are you looking at that as a development?
Well, I don't. A few pictures of some very frustrated people does not make a revolution. It has spread to 5 cities. There's a number of universities out there that have demonstrations, but most of them are peaceful. There's only a few incidences in major cities where people were shouting these kinds of things. But it's just they're frustrated, and there is economic hardship. And there's no question that the Chinese government is concerned. They've already issued a series of things. In the past, they had the national policy, which was zero COVID, but they allowed these housing complexes to make their own decisions about what they were, how they were going to handle different situations. So you'd have a housing complex of, 8,000-10,000 people. One person would get COVID, and they would decide to close it down, not in consultation with the city government or the district government. They just do it themselves because it was just easier, and they would avoid liability.
But doesn't the buck
say, well,
stop
we
with the
closed it down.
president? Isn't the zero COVID policy essentially,
Well, yes.
his brainchild, and therefore doesn't the buck stop with him? The fact that cities shut down so quickly in China.
No, I mean, zero COVID was something that was developed in relation to protecting China during a time when the pandemic was running, rife. I mean, there were huge costs. China actually went ahead in terms of longevity of the United States. The United States lost 3 years of longevity. They went from 79 to 76. China is still at 77. And they were able to maintain that. They grew their economy. So, you could say the buck stops there, but if you want to do that, during that 3-year period, the Chinese central government, by the people, by Pew and outside survey companies, said that over 90%, some said 95% of the people had trust in the government. It's just as we're getting towards the tail end, as China is trying to move from using a sledgehammer to a scalpel to deal with COVID-19, they've had mixed results, and they're going to continue to adjust them until they get the right one.
Right.
They have no interest in seeing their economy going downhill. They don't want to see people suffer. So they just have to get it right. That's all.
Well, let's see how this plays out. Thank you very much, Mr. Inar Tangen, for joining us there from Beijing. Thank you.